I've always been a firm believer that the loudest guy in the room is usually the weakest, and the quietest one is the one you should probably be worried about. And for years, I was that quiet guy, just a dude who spent 12 years in the infantry, seeing things I'd rather not talk about, and carrying around enough titanium in my joints to set off a metal detector from a block away. But when I finally hung up the uniform, all I wanted was a piece of land, a lawn to mow, and a wife who didn't in Oppos. T have to worry every time the phone rang at 3 a.m. We found this place in a sleepy suburb of North Carolina, a corner lot with these massive oaks and a porch that caught the sunset just right. And for 3 years, it was heaven, until a man named Marshall Vance decided he wasn't into Oppos. T, just the HOA president, he was the local warlord. Marshall was one of those guys who probably got picked last for kickball his whole life and was now making it everyone else's problem, and he'd recruited these three, in quote, compliance officers, in quote, who were basically just middle-aged bullies in tactical polos, guys who acted like they were clearing rooms in Kandahar when they were really just looking for unapproved shades of beige. It started small, like a nagging toothache, with letters about my grass being a quarter-inch too high or the fact that my trash cans were visible for 10 minutes after the truck rolled by, and I ignored it. I really did, because when you've dealt with real insurgents, a guy with a clipboard doesn't in Oppos. T exactly strike fear into your heart. But things shifted when Marshall's little goon squad started targeting my wife, Sarah, because she's the kindest soul you'll ever meet, a landscape designer who spent her weekends turning our backyard into sanctuary, and apparently, her choice of native wildflowers was, in quote, non-compliant, in quote, with the neighborhoods, in quote, uniform aesthetic, in quote. One Tuesday, I was in my home office on a high-stakes consulting call, headset on, trying to focus on data projections, when I heard this muffled shouting from the driveway, and it wasn't in Oppos. T, the sound of neighbors chatting, it was that sharp, aggressive barking that sets off a very specific kind of alarm bell in my brain. I looked out the window, and my blood didn't into Oppos. T just boil. It went cold because there was Sarah standing by the driver's side of her SUV, and she was surrounded by Marshall's three stooges, led by a guy named Chet who looked like he'd spent more money on his, in quote, security, in quote, belt than on his education, and they were looming over her, waving these neon orange violation stickers in her face like they were warrants for her arrest. I dropped my headset, didn't in Oppos, to even say goodbye to the client, and I felt that old engine in my chest, the one I thought I'd decommissioned years ago, just roar back to life with a terrifying smoothness. As I stepped on the porch, I saw Chet reach out and grab Sarah's arm to stop her from getting into the car, and then he gave her this dismissive, arrogant shove that sent her stumbling back against the door, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and genuine fear, and in that moment, the suburban dad who liked craft beer and Sunday football disappeared. I didn't in Oppos. T-run, I didn't in Oppos. T-scream, I just walked down those stairs with a cadence I hadn't in Oppos. T-U since 2011, a heavy, rhythmic stride that meant someone's day was about to get very rat dark. Chet saw me coming and tried to puff out his chest, placing a hand on his hip like he was packing heat, and he barked, in quote, "Stay back, sir. This is an official enforcement action. Your wife is being cited for obstruction," end quote. And I just kept coming, my vision tunneling down until all I saw was the smugness on his face. I got within 6 inches of him, way inside his personal bubble, and I told him, in a voice that was barely a whisper but carried the weight of a freight train, end quote, "Take your hand off my wife and get off my property before you find out exactly why they gave me those medals you see in my office," end quote. Chet laughed in nervous, high-pitched sound, and he looked at his buddies for backup, saying something about how, end quote, "the veteran thinks he's still in the sandbox," end quote. And then he made the mistake of trying to put a hand on my chest to push me back. I didn't in Oppos to even think. The muscle memory just took over, and I caught his wrist, applied a quick downward pressure that sent him to his knees with a sickening pop, and as his buddy lunged at me from the left, I pivoted on my heel and delivered a short arc elbow that caught him square in the jaw, a sound like a dry branch snapping underfoot. The third guy, the youngest and biggest of the bunch, tried to tackle me, but he was slow and clumsy, and I just stepped offline, caught his momentum, and guided his face directly into the pillar of my own garage. And suddenly, the driveway wasn't in Oppos, a scene of HOA, in quote, enforcement, in quote, Anymore, it was a triage center for three guys who had severely overestimated their own toughness. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of Chet sobbing on the asphalt and the distant siren of a neighbor's car alarm that had been triggered by the scuffle. Sarah was shaking, so I pulled her behind me, my eyes scanning the street until I saw Marshall Vance's black Mercedes idling a few houses down. He'd been watching the whole thing like a coward, waiting for his dogs to finish the job, and I just pointed a finger at him, a silent promise that he was next. When the police arrived, they didn't end oppos. T find A in quote, violent veteran in quote, out of control. They found a man standing calmly over three intruders with his hands visible, and a wife who had the entire incident recorded on her phone from the moment they stepped onto our grass. It turned out the responding officer was a guy I'd done a few civilian tactical courses with, and he looked at the three guys moaning on my driveway, looked at the footage of Chet shoving my wife, and then looked at me and just sighed, and quote, self-defense looks good on you, brother, but you really did a number on their dental work, end quote. Marshall tried to come screaming onto the scene, shouting about, end quote, assault on HOA officials, end quote, and end quote, legal immunity, end quote. But the officer just cuffed Chet right there on the ground and told Marshall that unless he wanted to be charged with conspiracy to commit harassment, he needed to get back in his car and start looking for a very expensive lawyer. The fallout was beautiful, a slow-motion demolition of a petty empire, because once that video hit the community Facebook group, the floodgates didn't end oppos. T just opened, they burst, and suddenly dozens of families were coming forward with stories of how Marshall and his goons had extorted them, threatened their kids, and even poisoned a dog over a fence height dispute. We didn't end oppos. T just sued for the assault. We triggered a full forensic audit of the HOA's books, and wooed in oppos. T, you know it. Nearly $80,000 in, end quote. Maintenance fees, end quote, had vanished into a shell company owned by Marshall's brother-in-law. The night they hauled Marshall away in zip ties for embezzlement, the neighborhood felt different, like the air had finally cleared after a long, stifling humidity, and as Sarah and I sat on our porch, watching the sunset hit those wildflower gardens he hated so much, I realized that peace ISN and oppos. T's something you just find. It and oppos. As something you have to be willing to defend, sometimes with a quiet word, and sometimes with a very loud elbow. It makes you wonder, doesn't it, oppos, T it? How many of these tiny tyrants are running around in your own backyard, hiding behind a clipboard and a polo shirt, thinking they can touch your family without consequences? I know where I stand, and I'd do it all again in a heartbeat, because at the end of the day, a man's home is his castle, but only if he's got the spine to hold the gates. So tell me, have you ever had to stand up to a bully who thought a little bit of power made them invincible, or are you still waiting for your breaking point? Drop your stories in the comments. Let an oppos. Let's talk about where the line is drawn, because I have a feeling I'm not the only one who's had to remind the world that, in quote, quiet, in quote, doesn't an oppos, T mean, in quote, weak, in quote.